When you talk about a coach, it's often the sporting examples that come to mind. Imposing figures like Vince Lombardi or Bill Belichick in American football, or Pep Guardiola in everyone else's football. But coaching also plays a big part in business success, and this week's guest on Here Comes Pod, Nathan Rosenberg, is the business equivalent of these sporting titans. Through his consulting firm, the Rosenberg Group, and now Insigniam, Nathan has advised over 85,000 individuals and 12% of the world's biggest companies, including Sony Pictures, on how to improve business and personal performance. So enjoy the podcast and hopefully pick up some tips on how to earn a diamond as big as the Ritz. Hi, Nathan. Welcome to the podcast.
Danny, great to be working with you again.
Excellent. Lovely to have you. I always like to start with a fun question, which is, if you could be any character in a military-related movie, which character would you choose?
This is actually a pretty easy one for me to answer. Kevin Costner playing Lieutenant Tom Farrell in No Way Out, the movie with Gene Hackman. And Kevin Costner was portraying the job that I had as the executive support officer to the Secretary of Defense. And literally, Danny, when I saw the movie in the movie theater, I said out loud, it just jumped out of that's my office. And I was not a Soviet spy, but what a great movie that was. And he played the character really well.
Well, I love that film, and that was a tremendous twist in the movie at the end.
Oh, my God.
So,
yeah,
but I
never expected that at the end.
No, but we won't say anything just in case all the studio, right, film people, TV people listening to this pod haven't seen one of the great movies, but we hope they have. But I asked that question because you started your career, and you've just alluded to it, you started your career as an officer and aviator in the US Navy. Did you come from a military family, or what were the factors that motivated you to join the armed forces?
You know, Danny, I actually didn't. Now, my dad, all my uncles, probably like most men of that time, served in World War II. My father was a mess sergeant guarding prisoners of war up on the Canadian border. And my uncles were in the Navy and the Army. My uncle Eddie was a hero, was a paratrooper, and was shot through the throat and actually lived. So those uncles were and my dad were an inspiration. But I was a Boy Scout, and Boy Scouts made a big difference in my life. And it turned out that the assistant scoutmaster of the troop that I was in was also an Air Force Academy liaison officer. And that's how I ended up at the Air Force Academy and serving our country in the Navy.
And what did you do? I mean, were you flying fighter jets? What were you?
No, I flew search and rescue helicopters. I saved 21 people's lives, interdicted 4 ships coming up from Colombia with drugs. And boy, was that rewarding. There's nothing like watching somebody coming up in the basket whose life you just saved. And then I worked for the Secretary of Defense, as I alluded to earlier, as his executive support officer. Woke him up in the morning, put him to bed at night, handled all of his classified materials. So that was an incredible job for probably, I was at the time 25, 26 years old.
And what can the armed forces teach the corporate world about leadership and effective organizational transformation, do you think?
Oh, that's really a good question. You know, Danny, the military is highly bureaucratic, so I wouldn't want the military to teach that to business. But the sense of mission, the sense of purpose, the sense of being up to something really important, the biggest thing that goes with that is being part of a team. Never do you have the sense of hundreds of thousands of people who serve in the military. The sense is always of the small unit that you're part of, whether it's the aircraft crew or the squadron that you're a part of. And that sense of team and being part of and being counted on by a group of people. You know, in our research at Insigniam, it's really clear to us that while teams are sloppy, they are also the most effective way of organizing human activity. So I think the whole sense of mission and working in teams are 2 of the top lessons.
In 1981, you worked as a national security advisor to the Senate Majority Leader, having previously supported the Secretary of Defense, as you mentioned earlier. Having been on the inside in politics, now having moved on from the Navy, did you have a view on the kind of skills and characteristics that successful politicians exhibit?
Yeah. Robert Byrd, who was the majority leader that I advised, was a brilliant politician, an amazing, driven, self-sacrificing politician. The things that I saw in him, but also, I knew then Senator Biden, I knew Senator John McCain, I knew lots and lots of senators. The things that I would say, number one is they were all leaders in their own right, and many different styles, many different qualities, but all leaders in their own right. Secondly, decisiveness. I would be in meetings with Senator Byrd. One of us would brief him and he would be ready to make a decision. Also, which I talked about maybe even earlier, is a commitment to service. Not all, but many of the people that represent us in Washington, Danny, they could be doing other jobs and making a lot more money. And their commitment to serving this country of ours really, is extraordinary. And then finally, I would say big picture. They've got the big picture and they're able to connect the dots to bring it together. And that I see to some degree has been lost in Washington. I still follow politics. I'm not active anymore, but I still follow politics. And that having the big picture and being able to connect the dots, I don't see so much anymore.
F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote that there are no second acts in American lives, but your second act was to move into the business world, first in property, and then in 1985 launching the consulting firm Rosenberg Solomon that invested in small companies and worked with their management to increase their value. What inspired you to launch this business, and how did you help these companies to build value?
Well, it actually goes back to politics, believe it or not. Danny, I aspired to be president of the United States when I was a younger man. And I observed, having worked in the Senate, I observed that people who had personal wealth, when they came into office, had a kind of independence, able to do the right thing regardless of the consequences, because they didn't depend on the salary. And so my decision was to go into something where I could build wealth. And the real estate investment business at the time had produced more multimillionaires than any other single business endeavor in the United States. And as I got into it, I hated the business. There was no passion to it. There was no human to human. It was just, how do we make the most money out of this property? And fortunately, we had a partnership dispute. And it was one of those deals where you could pass a number across the table and the other partners could either buy for that number or sell for that number. I got bought out. And my friend Tom Solomon and I decided to go into business together with this idea that we would invest in small companies and help them create value. And it actually worked. And that was my second act, as you said. It really worked. And we had a great run together. But as we got into it, what we realized is the investments didn't produce income. And so we then started doing some management consulting for fee rather than for equity. And that's how I fell into the consulting business.
It was funny, something you said earlier about having a business career with maybe property at the heart of it as a pathway to making it to the presidency. I think I've heard that somewhere before, but I'm struggling to put my finger on it. But maybe by the end of the podcast, it'll come back to me. What is the difference between great leadership and great management? And do each require a different skill set?
This is a great question. And I think, frankly, what's in the background of the question, the context of the question, has done damage to some businesses. Years ago, a Harvard Business School professor said that most businesses are overmanaged and underled. And I think that led to management versus leadership rather than management and leadership. In fact, when I studied management at the Air Force Academy, Danny, the leadership was seen to be part of the management function, along with budgeting and planning and controlling and all the normal things that we would think of as part of management. So I think that if you have leadership without management, you kind of get a little chaos, lack of support for the big idea. And if you have management without leadership, it just becomes more of the same. You know, if you think back to the movie Gandhi, that great, which by the way is a great lesson in leadership. But if you think back to Gandhi, when the men are marching on the salt works, knowing that they're going to get beat, or if you think about Dr. Martin Luther King walking across the bridge in Selma, Alabama, how do you get people to walk into that kind of violence by choice? Well, that's a great leadership question. But then what follows in Gandhi is the men and women that are there to support the people who are going to get beat with the bandages, with the water, with the things that are needed to take care of them. That's good management. And you need both, I think.
Well, and great that you picked a Sony Pictures movie as well. To
Yeah,
illustrate that point, to maintain the theme. That's fantastic. The social anthropologist Joseph Henrich identifies weird people, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, as being economically successful and psychologically different from non-weird people. It's a really interesting book, which I've
wow, I never heard that before. I'm going to dig into that a little bit.
He characterizes weird people as highly individualistic, non-conformist, analytical, and control orientated. So that's a lot of Western people fall under that category, and actually their brains are a bit rewired to be more analytical. The Rosenberg Group, and subsequently Insigniam, which he founded in 2005, operated and does operate on a global basis. How important are both psychological and cultural differences to the way businesses and individuals operate? And you've had exposure across multiple geographies, so you can have a perspective on that.
First of all, just a flat answer, those psychological and cultural differences are critical. And, as a management consultant, I will tell you that you can get in a lot of trouble, not A, knowing, and B, respecting. So I'll give you two examples. When we first opened our office in Hong Kong, one of our very first clients was a trading company, what they call Hongs in Hong Kong, and was mostly run by Western Europeans. But once you got below the C-suite level, it was mostly local folks. And I was working with this team of people, and I asked a question. And, if I'd been working with your group in Sony Pictures, somebody would have raised their hand and had a response, and then we would have gotten off to the races. Well, nobody said anything. So then I cajoled a little bit, and nobody said anything. And then finally, the CFO said, Nathan, we ought to take a break. So we take a break, and he said, okay, listen. If you put them into small groups, they'll talk to each other. And then if you ask them to report on what they talked about, you won't be able to stop the conversation. And I literally did exactly what he said. And what I learned was in many parts of Asia, people have been taught culturally to not speak up in large groups. And therefore, you have to figure out other ways. Whereas, in this weird persona that we're talking about, it's natural to speak up in a large group. So I think those factors are really important. At the same time, I remember a quote from Jan Carlson, the former CEO of SAS Airlines, and what Carlson said was, "While we honor national cultures, what's really important is our own corporate culture." And I think good executives design and install cultures that can go around the globe, that aren't particularly American, that aren't particularly Chinese, aren't particularly European, but are appropriate to the business that they're in.
So talking about how to create that culture, you, as I say, founded Insigniam. Before it was the Rosenberg Group, and it focuses on the human factor in business, organizational transformation, breakthroughs, and executive coaching. What were and are the key principles that underpin the approach of what was the Rosenberg Group, now in Insigniam, and the support that you provide businesses and executives?
Well, two principles to start with. First of all, we don't claim to know our clients' business better than they do. In fact, my joke is, Mr. CEO, Ms. CEO, if I ever try to tell you how to run your business, you should throw me out of your office. And if you don't know how to run your business, your shareholders ought to throw you out of your office. So, Danny, we've learned more about the human brain in the last 25 years, call it, than all the rest of human history. And in fact, much of what we learn actually contradicts what we thought to be true in the previous part of human history. So, for example, you and I were taught we think and then we act. Well, we now know that we act and then we think. That is to say, we are already in action and then we become conscious of the action and we put a label on it. And the thing that I see is, first of all of us have blind spots. My dad used to say, son, if you walk around the trash can on the back porch more than 3 times, you don't see it anymore. And one of the things is that our approach is to get executives to look at their businesses in new ways, to see perspectives that they never saw before, to consider actions that either they had rejected in the past, now conditions have changed, or they haven't ever considered. And obviously, organizational performance is in the end going to be tied to action and taking more of the right action, less of the wrong actions, and thinking about things in different ways. And I think we're particularly good at that. The second factor, Danny, is he's reputed to say, I don't know that he actually said it, Peter Drucker is reputed to say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Whether that's true or not, it certainly is the case. And the case is that no matter how smart executives are, no matter how good the opportunity is in the marketplace, without a culture that pulls for that, it's like a horse running a race with 10 pounds of lead in the saddle. You've got a handicap. There's something that's going to hold back corporate performance. And most executives don't see culture as their job. Jack Welch famously once said, hard is easy, soft is hard. And most executives kind of poo-poo soft as, yeah, well, that's not really important. Let's work on the hard things. And I think, we bring a new perspective to that where they start to see, oh, these soft things really can impact the hard numbers.
Can entrepreneurs thrive in corporate life?
Very hard, very hard. Boy, I have had coaching relationships with so many entrepreneurs whose companies were bought by big companies. And after 2 or 3 years, they're just gone. It's like squeezing toothpaste out of the tube. They don't fit in that environment. Because why? Well, because entrepreneurism, by definition, is taking on risk. In large corporations, what's most valued is predictability. And so it's a little bit like water and oil. They just don't mix very well. That's not to say it can happen, but it's pretty tough, Danny. And I've watched really good executives try to inject entrepreneurship into their corporate culture. And it just, I can't think of one occasion where it's actually been successful.
And that's interesting because I remember from the time that we worked together that one of the principles that you communicated to us as a group was that in a big company, roughly 80% of what you do is going to happen whether you're there or not. If you get knocked over by a bus, that's going to happen irrespective. And so you have to operate successfully in the gap, in that 20% to make that difference. And that feels quite like being an entrepreneur in a corporate culture. So is that something that you try and instill, that to some extent, that entrepreneurial, we've got to make things a little bit different. Otherwise, we'll only keep doing the same thing over and over again.
Well, and your industry is particularly a great case study. You're probably not old enough to remember, but Gulf and Western decided that they bought Paramount and decided that they could run Paramount, based on metrics. And it didn't turn out so well. because there, in the movie business and the television business, there is this entrepreneurial factor. Going back to your question about management leadership, when I think of Columbia Pictures, when I think of Amy Pascal, Peter Schlessel, Matt Tolmach, and Doug Belgrad as a management team, each one of them brought something different, but literally thought like entrepreneurs and worked like entrepreneurs, often running into, as you know, the Sony bureaucracy, often running into differences in national cultures, all the things that we've talked about for the last 20 minutes or so. There's a perfect case study, and those guys did a great job navigating that, making films that the bureaucracy probably would not have put their rubber stamp on, and yet finding a way to get them greenlit and into production and producing great wealth for Sony Pictures, for Sony big Sony.
Let's talk a little bit about the movie business. So there are no second acts in American Lives, and I keep referring to F. Scott Fitzgerald because I know you really focused on him when you were.
I love that book. Yeah.
So it's a quote from the notes to The Last Tycoon, a book set in the movie business of the 30s, focusing on the character of Monroe Starr, who was based on the real-life MGM movie mogul Irving Thalberg. And the Thalberg building is the centerpiece of the Sony studio. And you have done a lot of work over the years with the executives at Sony Pictures and possibly others, but those are certainly the ones I know about. And that's in a career that has spanned over 85,000 individuals and 12% of the world's biggest companies. Can you compare and contrast the movie/entertainment business with some of the other business sectors you've worked in terms of executive dynamics, success criteria, and the ability of executives within it to create the kind of paradigm shifts that you encourage people and executives to do to drive these organizations?
Yeah. Danny, speaking of, I bought the documentary on him and shared it with Matt and Doug, Matt Tolmach and Doug Belgrad, because he was an awesome entrepreneur, great leader, and great manager. So it's interesting that that's the reference for the start of this question. Your industry attracts some of the smartest people in the world, top graduates from some of the best schools in the world, you being one of those examples, by the way. And what I see is, in the Dickens book, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. What I would say about the entertainment industry is some of the best executives I've ever worked with and some of the worst executives I've ever worked with.
Please don't name names on the ballot.
I won't name names, but
I can't afford the legal bill.
Exactly. But, to me, because it's a creative industry, I just can't think of any industry that's more creative than the entertainment industry at its heart. There's a lot of quirky people. And I remember my very first assignment at Sony Pictures after Beth brought us in was dealing with the division in the television business, where two executives were almost at each other's throat. And, John Feldheimer, I think, had basically thrown his hands up in the air. And when you get people to talk to each other, when you get people to listen to each other, something really good happens. And that worked out. So I think the difference is, first of all, the executives aren't producing anything. The nature of the business is the directors, the producers, the writers, the actors, none of those work for the studios. They're all independents, as you know, and that's different than the automobile business, where you own the factory, you own the designs, and everybody who works in the factory works for you. So I think that's a big difference about the entertainment industry is its fractured nature, which goes back to the time that we were just talking about when Irving Thalberg, they had contracts and people worked under contracts, and that's just not the case anymore. The second thing is the hit and miss nature of the business. John Calley said he thought that Amy Pascal was the best movie picker that he had ever met. And yet Amy had hits and misses. And I think that's just part of your guys' business, is the ups and downs of it, which is different than, we did the market research. We're pretty sure this has a desire. There's a desire for this product, for this service in the marketplace. And if we do it well, it probably works out. And that's not the case in your guys' business. You can do it exactly right, and the audience may not be there.
Jay Gatsby is another iconic Fitzgerald character, a man who builds fantastic wealth for very personal reasons. Thinking about the senior leaders you've worked with, how important are personal motivations to the business success they have had? And is there a danger that individual goals and corporate goals can easily diverge to produce destructive outcomes?
Yeah. My old mentor, Michael Jensen, former Harvard professor, Michael passed on, but Mike wrote a very important paper with one of his colleagues called The Theory of the Firm. And in the Theory of the Firm, Mike said that the interests of the individual executive and the interests of the shareholders diverge over time. Riding in the corporate jet becomes more important than, how am I going to increase shareholder wealth? How am I going to satisfy customers? How am I going to make sure that we're taking care of the environment? And I think, Danny, what brings that back together is when the interests of the executive is tied to the success of the corporation, typically through compensation. Unfortunately, there's been this explosion in CEO compensation. To me, it's horrific. I'm not going to get on my bandwagon about it, but I could easily. And the distance, the delta between what the proverbial man or woman on the factory floor is being paid and what the guy or gal in the C-suite is being paid, I think is demoralizing, frankly. The American worker, middle class, basically had no increase in their income or in their wealth for over 2 decades. In the same period of time, CEO comp exploded. And I think part of the backlash that we see in American politics today, the on both the left and the right, is a product of that delta. And I think CEOs really need to look at, are they worth what they're being compensated? I think boards need to look at, do we really need to pay this guy or gal what we're paying them to keep them around? And then put the interest back at the people that actually do the work of the organization and invest in their growth and in the betterment of their life. One of the things that's very clear to me, Danny, is who someone is being in the present is given by the future into which they're working. And years ago, the Yankelovich organization, since World War II, I think, has been polling the American family. And the only factor that has a direct correlation to the quality of life in the American family is, do you expect to make more money next year than you made this year? And I think that's a really important factor for executives to think about when they're thinking about the tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of people that work in their organizations. And I don't think that's where most CEOs think. That's probably more than you wanted in an answer to that question, but I think I maybe did get a little bit on my soapbox, so I apologize.
No, I think it's great. I think it's a really interesting observation and very relevant to the political discourse at the moment. But I think what's interesting, just to think about the flip side, is to what extent or how often do you come up against the imposter syndrome with senior leaders, and how do you coach around that?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all of us, to be human is to have that voice in your head saying, really? Danny, I got into the consulting world when I was 34 years old, talking to the CEO of one of the largest, most successful companies in the world. And I always had, does this guy know I don't know what I'm talking about? So I think that's human. I don't think it's particular to a individual human being. And I think at some point, good executives, good leaders actually come to grips with, I am who I am, and I have certain weaknesses, honest, authentic, but I also have these great strengths. My partner in the founding of Insigniam, Sheeta Bina, I remember one day she said, "You know what? There is nobody better at what we do than me." And I didn't hear it as braggadocio. I didn't hear it as patting herself on the back. I heard it as, I am not an imposter. I actually have great value to give to executives who retain our firm. And I think I'm thinking of an executive in your guys' business who I had the chance to know and work with a little bit, and very self-aware of limitations, very self-aware of weaknesses, but at the same time, willing to stand on the strengths that he has to lead one of America's greatest and largest corporations.
So then talking about some of those leaders, who have been the leaders and change agents that have inspired you over the years?
I have what I call industrial heroes, and there are people who did extraordinary things, made something happen, mostly in the face of resistance or even disagreement. The first one is a guy named Bill Fitzgerald. Bill was an executive at Control Data Corporation, used to build the biggest, fastest computers in the world, and Bill headed up their U.S. government business, and saw the need that if they did not reinvent themselves, literally reinvent themselves, the day of the big fast computer was gone. And Bill pushed for it and made a real difference, not just for the shareholders, but for the thousands of people who worked in that company to be able to retain their jobs and take care of their families. And Fitz was amazing that way. And then I worked for years with at the time, young guy at Clorox, Tim Bailey, who again recognized the need for a transformational approach to business and just jumped out. And he was 4 levels down in the organization, Danny, and he led the transformation of the organization in that way. And I talked about Amy and those guys. That Columbia, but also Michael Grindon. I think, Michael had real organizational courage. There was a time when the beginning of the digital era, in fact, you'll remember this now that I think about it, the digital era, and Sony had no digital policy. And Michael, not his job, convened a meeting of the heads of all the parts of Disney's business, got in touch with the CEO in Japan of big Sony and said, we have to sort this out. And over a weekend, it got sorted out. And then just big names, Alfred Sloan from General Motors. My life in General Motors is sitting on that bookshelf behind me, and it inspired me. And in your guys' industry, Bob Iger, I think, is a force of nature and amazing. So those are some of my heroes in this business, and I could probably list 20 more people that I've either got to know or read about who've been inspirations. Danny, I've been doing this for 39 years almost, and I still tap dance to work every day. And part of that is because I get to work with great people. It's not always true, but usually the cream does rise to the top in business. Yeah.
And what advice would you give your younger self now that you've been through all those experiences?
I had to learn this the hard way. Without integrity, without your word, you got nothing. And I think integrity and probity in business are the two, A, toughest lessons that I've learned, and B, the most valuable lessons I learned. When I was younger, I was a liar, and the lies almost jumped out of my mouth. I did not learn the lessons of the honor code at the Air Force Academy, and I wish I had learned those lessons earlier, because to me, it all comes down to word. It all comes down to what did I say and doing what I said, or at least honoring my word in the matter.
Finally, I always like to finish with a fun question about media. So if you had to pick one film TV series, and fiction book that shines a light on leadership and change, for better or for worse, which ones would you choose to share with us now?
Yeah. Well, when I was at the Air Force Academy, we were forced to watch 12 O'Clock High, but I would not recommend 12 O'Clock High. The one I would recommend is the Ron Howard film, Apollo 13. We literally use clips from that. Well, you know this. We use clips from that movie in our leadership development work to watch what's happening in the capsule and the leadership in the capsule, but just as importantly, the leadership on the ground. Over and over and over again, there's demonstrations of really great leadership. And to your earlier point, the failure of leadership. And, I literally will say to clients, look, if you don't have anything else to do this weekend, watch Apollo 13 for the lessons in that movie.
Well, Nathan Rosenberg, thank you so much for being a guest on Here Comes Pod. It's been a fascinating chat. A famous fictional pilot once advised, let the Wookiee win. But I think the insights that we got today from a real life pilot were far more helpful. So thank you for that.
Danny, it's great to be with you again. I have fond memories of the work we did together. So to reconnect, and I think your podcasts are fabulous. So thanks for the opportunity to be one of them.
Excellent. My pleasure.
Bye, my friend.